Welcome to Felony Friday, a presentation of the Lions of Liberty podcast. Here is your host, John Odermatt.
Felons, friends, and freedom lovers, welcome back once again for another episode of Felony Friday right here on the Lions of Liberty podcast. As our returning listeners already know, this is a weekly podcast which focuses on exposing justice in the broken criminal justice system. And I think we have a show today that is going to do just that. It's going to really focus in and shine some light on some terrible injustice in the criminal justice system. And I'll get to who my guest is in just a minute here. But before I do that, I just want to ask my listeners, I want to let my listeners know how you guys can support our show here at Lions of Liberty. You can do that. One way you can do that is by shopping through Amazon through our affiliate link. Doing so will cost absolutely nothing to you. You would just buy whatever you normally buy, and you just shop through our link. You can find this link at lionsofliberty.com/Amazon. So please try that out today. And the second thing I want to talk to you guys about is the show notes page. We're going to talk about a couple different stories today, a couple different news stories, and I want you to be able to find them. So please check out the show notes page at lionsofliberty.com/FF32. This is episode 32, so that is where the 32 comes from. My guest today is Anthony Pappas. Happy to have Anthony on the show. The way that I was introduced to Anthony is an interesting story. I was introduced by Alex Merced. And of course, our frequent listeners would know that Alex was a previous guest here on the Lions of Liberty podcast, episode 218 with Mark Clare. Alex is the current Libertarian candidate for U.S. Senate in New York. I believe him and Anthony met through political events in New York as Anthony was seeking the Green Party nomination for the U.S. Senate seat. I believe we can talk about that with Anthony later. Anthony has been forced to deal with some tough times resulting from family court rulings. As a result, he's become a passionate advocate for family court reform and reforming judicial immunity. Anthony will be sharing his story today, and we'll also hopefully have some time to talk about some other cases in the family court area as well. Just some quick background on Anthony. He was born in New York City back in 1946, January 1946. He graduated from Stuyvesant High School, I think I'm saying that right, in New York City in 1962, earned a bachelor's degree from MIT in 1965, majoring in economics, minoring in mathematics, and he also has a master's degree and a PhD from Yale University in economics as well. He has been a college professor in the Department of Economics and Finance at St. John's University since 1976 and continuing today. Anthony has also owned and operated a securities brokerage firm. Anthony, welcome to Felony Friday. So glad you could be here.
Good evening. Thank you for having me, John.
It's good to have you here, Anthony. And in the lead up to this interview, we did, we conversed a little bit on Facebook and through email. And you communicated with me regarding some issues with family court, some issues that have you personally. And I wanted to, but if it's okay with you, I kind of wanted to read the part of the note that you sent me just to kind of to set up what we're going to talk about. And this is a quote from you. You said, "In the U.S., there is no effective accountability over the judiciary branch of the government. In family courts, as civil courts, a single judge can make capricious and arbitrary decisions regarding a person's children, property, and well-being, including incarceration. In written decisions, this is being you, labeled a terrorist, like the perpetrator of the Fort Hood massacre, and a violent Class B felon." So first thing I wanted to ask you about, Anthony, in regards to that quote, can you tell the Felony Friday audience a little bit about your past and how you became to be, how you got in this situation where you ended up in family courts and were labeled a terrorist and ended up being classified as a Class B felon?
I was married to my ex-wife for over 20 years. And then in 2004, she decided to file for divorce. So we wound up going to a civil court for that. We weren't actually in a family court because my children were over 18 and there weren't any issues regarding, child custody and visitation. So it was the regular, civil court in New York State, that would be the Supreme Court, which is the trial court of jurisdiction for civil cases. So the divorce case, proceeded, providing information and testimony on various assets and property that I held or that I had accumulated over my life. And I saw that, the judge was not favorably inclined to, the evidence I was presenting. And I wrote a letter, protesting, some of the interim decisions that he was making. Eventually, as a result of that letter, he got annoyed and he issued a decision where he wrote down that I had made, quote, thinly veiled threats in the idiom used by the perpetrator of the Fort Hood massacre, unquote. And these threats were ostensibly reported to the Judicial Threats Unit in the Office of Court Administration.
If I can just jump in very quickly here to ask a question. So can you say kind of what was said in the letter that you sent him?
Well, around 2009, the Fort Hood massacre occurred. And to refresh everyone's memory, Nidal Hassan was an Army psychiatrist, and he shot, 13 soldiers and wounded 32. So in my letter to Judge Gartenstein, I drew a parallel between Nidal Hassan as an Army psychiatrist who was supposed to help people, and my ex-wife, who was a guidance counselor, and likewise was supposed to be helping people or guiding elementary school students. And I was just contending that, she was a difficult person who had created turmoil in the schools where she worked, that some of her testimony was not accurate, and that this was another example of a person who supposedly was doing good, but who was in fact, just causing trouble for the sake of causing trouble. So the judge was annoyed at that, and he turned this innocuous letter into a threat in the idiom used by the perpetrator of the Fort Hood massacre. Now, what's disturbing about that is that we may all be aware that if somebody makes threats, they are supposed to be arrested by the FBI or Homeland Security. So, for example, if you're a high school student, you can't just, put on Twitter or on Facebook, "Oh, I'm so angry at my algebra teacher, I'm going to, punch him in the face." Or "I'm so angry at my history teacher, I feel like blowing up the cafeteria." If you make threats of that kind, you're supposed to be arrested. And, we see countless examples of that, where, people make impetuous threats, whether as teenagers or as adults when they're disturbed, and, they wind up being arrested. Now, fortunately, in my situation, I was not arrested, but the dislike of the judge, for my objections and my contention that he was treating me unfairly, was enough for him to impose, punitive, financial impositions on me, which were, totally unfair. And, at some point, somebody could regard as life-threatening. Now, the other aspect of, his biased decision was the contention that I was a violent Class B felon. Class B felonies would be in the category of manslaughter, where there's actually a dead body, or it would be arson or rape or sodomy. Mine would be assault 1. So what he wrote down in his decision was that I punched my wife, fractured her face. She had reconstructive surgery with anesthesia. She went to the hospital and it cost $9,000 and she charged it on a credit card. Okay, well, if you commit something like that, which is a serious, criminal act, Class B felony, equivalent to manslaughter, you should be convicted and go up to Attica State Prison for 25 years. Now, when I read this decision, I pondered what to do. You're taken aback and shocked.
Can I jump in again here? Because I know our listeners are going to have a question here too. So where did that story come from then? Was there any truth to it? Did your ex-wife actually go get surgery, or what happened there? Is there more that can be added?
No, it was basically a perjury and, exaggeration by the judge, because he was, looking to, crucify me or to, find reasons to rule against me.
That was a fabrication then?
Any sensible jurist would understand that if somebody goes to the hospital with a major injury, like a bullet wound or a fractured face, first of all, the personnel at the hospital in the emergency room or the doctors, they're mandated reporters. So they are supposed to report the injury to the police to conduct an investigation. Or typically in many emergency rooms, you actually have a policeman stationed in the emergency room because, people brought in by ambulance, they walk in with major injuries. So again, the charge that a major Class B felony had been committed was, could be regarded as totally irrational and biased. And it was designed to be propaganda so that, the judge could impose, severe financial impositions on me. And of course, it, creates emotional distress because, you don't know what can happen in this system where there's no accountability. In theory, the judge could order someone to arrest you and you would be imprisoned awaiting trial. You don't know how to deal with this, especially if you have no experience and, you don't have a training in the law. So it's, very distressing.
What impacts has this ruling had on your life?
Well, the ruling imposed, financial impositions on me. And this ruling was made in 2010. Now, the first judge who, made these charges, I managed to get him to self-recuse himself from the case. So the case was about 95% completed. I complained about him to another judge, the Honorable Robert Ross, who was a compassionate and, sensible person. And after, some, back and forth, theatrics in the courtroom, Judge Gartenstein recused himself. And I thought, things would get better. But in a bizarre system, the next judge that I encountered was also irrational and biased. So instead of trying to comprehend why Gartenstein had removed himself from the case on his own volition, he accused me of playing a game and somehow bringing about Gartenstein's recusal. And he wrote, "It is alleged that defendant Anthony Pappas committed certain aberrant acts which brought about Gartenstein's recusal, which again is irrational. It implies that a defendant has the capacity to somehow do some irrational acts like, thumb your nose at the judge or do somersaults when you're giving testimony or twirl around and, do something bizarre. And then the judge accommodates himself and removes himself from your case. But, again, in a system with no accountability, you can have totally irrational and bizarre written decisions by judges which don't make sense. All right, so now the second judge was bad also. He retired, so the case proceeded to the third judge, Hope Schwartz Zimmerman, who is still presiding over it. And she was biased and prejudiced against me as well. So in her decisions of divorce, she repeated the accusations that I was a terrorist and a violent Class B felon. And she just imposed, ridiculous impositions on me to try to take away all my money or even take away money that didn't exist. So she did a calculation, and basically the calculation was that I had spent over $500,000 to send my 3 children to expensive private universities. This money went to the children's education at the universities and to their support. And she basically decided that now I owed this money to my wife. And she made up some lame excuse that my wife was not familiar with the family finances.
So because you paid to send your children to good colleges to get them an education that you thought that they needed, something that they probably agreed with you and consented to, and at the time were around the age of, I'm assuming, 18, they're saying that the judge is throwing that out the window and saying that this was all done, that you coerced your children to go into college and taking this money, basically.
Well, she's not saying they were coerced. She's making the bizarre argument that somehow this money was marital money, and that every time you write out a check for tuition or for the dormitory, you should have gotten like a written agreement from your wife to, write out a check, because she didn't know that the children were going to college or how expensive it was. So all this money somehow, you depleted and disadvantaged your wife. Totally a specious argument, which has no validity. But as I say, the judges can ignore the law and the facts, make up any excuses they want or, rationales, and, decide to take away your, money and your property. Now, fortunately, in my case, as I said, the children were over 18, and there weren't any issues about visitation or custody of the children. But what happens to thousands of other people across the United States is that you have these bonkers jurists who could be prejudiced or malicious against a father or a mother, and for totally irrational reasons, they will, take the children away from, one of the parents and give sole custody to the other. And this could mean, in some cases, parents haven't seen their little children that they love for 2 years or 5 years, or, every bizarre situation you can imagine takes place. Or you could have a situation where if you're the non-custodial parent If your child is injured, let's say in an automobile accident, and goes to the hospital, the custodial parent can direct the doctors and the nurses and tell them, don't let the other parent see the child in the hospital. And you as doctors don't discuss with him what his treatment should be or what his condition is, because I, as the custodial parent, have all the legal rights to the child. So any parent encountering this situation who loves their children and wants to find out how they are is going to be emotionally distressed. And what often happens in thousands of cases is the parents then commit suicide, or they commit murder-suicide. And you have these thousands of tragedies taking place, throughout the court system, because it's set up in some cases to exacerbate conflicts, produce irrational decisions, and force people to take their own lives.
It really is a crazy system. And you did send me several stories that I don't think we're going to have time to touch on today. I do want to talk about Stump versus Sparkman, the precedents for this judicial immunity. But first, before we move on to that, I just want to make one thing clear for our listeners. You keep saying that you were labeled by the judge as a Class B felon. You're not actually a Class B felon, right? Or are you? I just want to make sure to get clarity there.
No, I'm not. When I first got the decision from Gartenstein back in September 2010, as I say, as a private citizen or someone who's not up on legal proceedings, you say, well, what am I going to do? So I went to the district attorney of Nassau County, and I showed them the decision and basically said, well, here I am. The judge wrote, I fractured my wife's face. If you want to arrest me, here I am. So basically, they checked on their computer and told me, well, Mr. Pappas, if you had done that, we would have arrested you and we would have known about it, sort of validating the idea that if, someone goes to the hospital for reconstructive surgery, the hospital is supposed to report that this injury has taken place. Okay, now, what demonstrates the total arrogance and gall of the judges is that they can come up with something which you can demonstrably show is irrational and doesn't make any sense at all, and you still can't get the effective redress of grievances. If they wanted to accuse me of, being a bad husband, they could write, well, he slapped her every morning and every night, and, she suffered. And then it would be he said, she said, and, you couldn't necessarily disprove that. But, don't write something totally bizarre that this person committed something like manslaughter, but there's no dead body. Or, he fractured the wife's face, but somehow the police don't know about it, or the hospital hasn't reported it, or that this took place during the divorce trial and it wasn't mentioned except when my wife was giving testimony, 2 weeks ago. So you have this totally irrational situation, and you can't get anywhere in the system because there's a doctrine of absolute judicial immunity stymies all your efforts, and it resulted from an atrocious decision in the 20th century, which I would call the worst Supreme Court decision of the 20th century. Now, what happened in that case is a mother felt that, her 15-year-old daughter was not doing her homework, and she was going out with older men, She characterized the daughter as slightly retarded.
This was Stump versus Sparkman, 1978, right?
Yeah, that was the Stump versus Sparkman. It started in 1971, reached the Supreme Court of the United States after several years. So in 1971, when the girl was 15, the mother goes to the judge, I think you should sterilize my daughter. All right, so Judge Stump, he did not hold a hearing. He did not appoint an attorney to represent the girl as a minor. She was under 18. And he told her, go to the hospital to get your appendix removed. So the girl followed his instructions. The judge secretly told the surgeon at the hospital, do a tubal ligation, cutting the girl's fallopian tubes. And she was released from the hospital, and she didn't know what had happened. She did not have a chance to appeal. Linda K. Sparkman, married a few years later, discovered that instead of having her appendix taken out, she could not conceive, and she decided to sue the judge and everybody involved for violating due process and human rights. And the case went through the federal courts. The Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals that covers Indiana and other states in the Midwest felt that Judge Stump should be liable. Surprisingly, it went to the Supreme Court of the United States, since only 1% of cases reach the Supreme Court that request that they go there. But it went to the Supreme Court of the United States, and in a 5-3 decision, they conferred absolute judicial immunity upon Judge Stump and said he could not be sued. So, as I say, this decision is still binding precedent.
Sorry for jumping in here, but this is just, I hadn't heard of this case, Stump versus Sparkman. I hadn't heard of this precedent until I met you, Anthony. And I just have to say, reading through this, preparing for this interview, it blows me away that in America, this is happening. In a supposed free country, a judge can orchestrate a 15-year-old girl to be sterilized, can work behind the scenes with doctors, and the Supreme Court can say it's okay. It's because he's a judge, and you can't change the ruling. Judicial immunity, because if you tried to change it, you could be affecting the outcome and setting a bad precedent. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. The legal system in the United States would have collapsed if Linda K. Sparkman could hold the judge responsible in some way for her sterilization. So it's totally irrational. It's unethical, immoral. It's against any principles of the founding fathers that there should be checks and balances over the different branches of the government. And the extensions of the decision are that basically the judge can be malicious. He can do something that's against the law. He can do it knowing it's against the law. Whatever action he takes as a judge, he has absolute judicial immunity, which is a status that no other group of persons has. Police can't just take out their gun and shoot you by saying, oh, I'm frightened because you're standing next to me, so I decided to shoot you. And, prosecutors likewise should not, engage in schemes to put people in jail or to cover up evidence that would exonerate somebody. They are supposed to function in a responsible manner and be accountable also.
It really does put judges above the law. And there are, you've sent me several cases to highlight this, 3 or 4 other stories to talk about this. And I do want to have you back on the show for a part 2 to really dive into this more, Anthony. We did have some technical difficulties leading up to the show today that's limited our time. I do want to thank you for joining Felony Friday today, Anthony, and sharing your story. I'm sure this has really blown a lot of people away and really slapped them in the face, hopefully woken people up to just this crazy injustice of judicial immunity. So I'm sorry I kind of interrupted you a little bit there, Anthony, but we do have to have a hard stop right now. Thank you for coming on the show.
You're welcome. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
That was a really interesting and eye-opening conversation today that we had with Anthony Pappas. I want to thank Anthony again for taking the time to come on Felony Friday and to share his story with the Felony Friday audience. You know, I'm sure it's not easy for him to talk about this nightmare that he has experienced. And he even said that, you know, it could have been a lot worse if his kids were under the age of 18 at the time that this occurred, with this judge basically intervening themselves in his life. It could have been a lot worse for him, and he could have lost the right to see his children if they were under the age of 18. But luckily, that's not what happened. I definitely do want to have Anthony back on the show. There's a couple other cases that we want to talk about, some that our listeners probably might be familiar with, some that really haven't received any coverage in any way whatsoever. But they all highlight this injustice of judicial immunity and this lack of accountability in the judicial system. You know, it is terrifying to hear the impact that a judge can have on an individual's life, you know, with no checks or balances and absolutely no limit on their influence. A judge can essentially just make up a story, label you a felon, and then they can use that against you, that made-up story, that made-up label of a crime that didn't even happen. They can use that to drastically impact a person's life, to take things away from them, to take away the ability to see their children, to take away their property, to take away their financial well-being. So it's definitely a very scary thing and something that I think needs a light shined on it. So that's why I wanted to talk about it on today's show, and that's why I will have Anthony back on the show to talk about some other cases. Anthony is an advocate for this, and he's out there working hard trying to grow awareness about it. So be sure, guys, just want to say a couple more things. Be sure to follow the Lions of Liberty on Facebook and on Twitter. And be sure to join our private Facebook group, the Lions of Liberty Forum. You can do that just by going on Facebook, punching Lions of Liberty Forum in the search bar. It'll pop up and we'll get you approved as quickly as we can. Also, if the best way you can help the show, I think at least, is by going on iTunes or Stitcher Radio and subscribing to the show. We have 3 shows per week, and we would love you to listen to every single show. You can just have it delivered right to your iPhone or Android device, right there, automatically downloaded for you to listen to every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Friday, of course, is Felony Friday, what you're listening to right now. We have a bunch of other great shows. We're having a lot more roundtables, I think. I think each month we're going to have at least 1, maybe 2 roundtable discussions where we'll talk about political events of the day. Mark Clare obviously has his interview show where he's interviewing great minds throughout the libertarian and political movement. And of course, we have our sort of new show. We've had it for about a month now, Mr. Johnson's Libertyhood, and that is hosted by Brian McWilliams. And Brian is doing a fantastic job with that, doing a very funny look into the presidential campaign of Gary Johnson and Bill Weld. You can't just say one of them because they're running a dual campaign. That's it for today, guys. As always, thank you for listening. This is John Odermatt signing off. Always remember to keep your head up and the fires of liberty burning.